The storm had been relentless for hours, battering the earth with a fury that seemed almost personal. Rain lashed against the windshield in torrents, the wipers struggling to clear even a sliver of visibility ahead. The ambulance rumbled down the deserted stretch of highway, its headlights cutting weakly through the sheets of rain. The only sound besides the drumming rain and the wind howling through the trees was the rhythmic hum of the tires against the wet asphalt. Inside the ambulance, Sarah kept a firm grip on the steering wheel, her fingers tense. The adrenaline from the last emergency call still coursed through her veins, but the exhaustion was beginning to creep in. Beside her, Lucas sat with one arm resting on the center console, his eyes flicking from the rain-slicked road ahead to the unreadable data on the monitor in front of him. "Feels like the end of the world out here," he muttered, shifting slightly in his seat. His voice was barely audible over the relentless drumming of rain against metal. Sarah exhaled sharply. "Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if the road floods before we get back." She adjusted her grip on the wheel, blinking against the brief flashes of lightning that illuminated the landscape in blinding white. The trees that lined the road were barely visible, their silhouettes warping and bending under the force of the wind. Every few seconds, thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very air around them. The drive back to the station was supposed to be uneventful. They had done their job. Another life stabilized, another emergency averted. Now it was just about getting home safely. But the storm made even that a challenge. Lucas shifted again, rubbing his temple. "Feels like one of those nights where something crazy happens." Sarah didn't answer, but she knew exactly what he meant. Nights like these always seemed to bring something strange, an accident, a distress call in the middle of nowhere, something inexplicable. She focused on the road, trying to ignore the gnawing unease creeping up her spine. And then it happened. A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the road ahead like a flickering photograph. In that brief second of brightness, Sarah's eyes caught movement. A shape, barely distinguishable against the dark backdrop of the storm, stood in the middle of the road. Her breath hitched. "Shit," she hissed, slamming her foot against the brake. The ambulance lurched violently, tires skidding against the wet pavement. The vehicle swerved slightly before grinding to a shaky halt, the sudden stop sending a shudder through the chassis. Both paramedics were thrown forward slightly, restrained only by their seatbelts. For a moment, the only sound was the rain hammering against the roof, the wipers frantically swiping back and forth. Lucas was the first to speak. "What the hell was that?" Sarah's fingers were still clenched around the wheel. Her heart pounded as she strained to see through the windshield. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, revealing a figure standing motionless in the downpour. A horse. Not just any horse, a wild Mustang, its dark coat glistening under the rain, muscles taut beneath its drenched skin. Its mane was soaked, clinging to its neck in thick, tangled strands. The animal's chest rose and fell in heavy, deliberate breaths, its nostrils flaring as steam curled from them into the cold night air. Sarah's pulse thrummed in her ears. A Mustang? Out here? In the middle of the storm? Lucas leaned forward, squinting. "That's the horse. A wild one." "No shit," Sarah muttered, barely above a whisper. "It should have run. Any normal horse would have bolted the moment it saw the bright lights, heard the roar of the engine, sensed the unnatural presence of the ambulance in the darkness. But this one didn't move. It was staring at them. Something about the way it stood sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. It wasn't frozen in fear, nor was it lost and panicked. No, this Mustang had purpose. It was there in that exact spot for a reason. The rain poured relentlessly, bouncing off the asphalt in chaotic patterns. The storm was a beast of its own, but the Mustang remained unmoving, unwavering against the onslaught of wind and water. Lucas shifted, eyes darting to Sarah. "Why isn't it running?" Sarah didn't have an answer. The horse shook its head suddenly, droplets of rain spraying in all directions. Its ears flicked back, then forward again, as if listening, waiting. Then, to their absolute astonishment, it took a step forward. Sarah stiffened. The Mustang's hooves clapped against the wet pavement, slow and deliberate. It wasn't charging, wasn't panicked. It was approaching them. Lucas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That's weird. Sarah could only nod. The horse stopped again, just within the ambulance's headlights, its large dark eyes locking onto them with unsettling intensity. Then, suddenly, it tossed its head and stomped its front hoof against the ground. Hard. The sound echoed through the air despite the relentless storm. Another stomp. Then another. Sarah's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Her pulse thundered in her ears. It's trying to get our attention, she breathed. Lucas turned to her sharply. What? She swallowed hard, keeping her gaze locked on the animal. It's not scared. It's not lost. It's trying to tell us something. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the Mustang's muscular frame in eerie brightness. For a split second, it almost looked ghostly, like something pulled from an old legend, an omen, a spirit of the storm itself. And then, as if confirming Sarah's unspoken thought, the horse let out a loud, piercing whinny that cut through the chaos of the night. The sound sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. The Mustang shook its head violently, took another step forward, and stomped again. Lucas exhaled sharply. Okay, this is officially creepy. Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. She was transfixed. There was intelligence in the horse's eyes, something beyond instinct, beyond mere curiosity. It was deliberate. It was trying to be seen, trying to be heard. The rain intensified, drumming against the ambulance with renewed force. The wind howled, bending trees along the roadside, making the world around them feel even more surreal. But the Mustang remained, unwavering, its breath visible in the cold air, its body rigid with purpose. Lucas swallowed. Sarah, what do we do? Sarah didn't have an answer, because for the first time in her life, sitting there in the middle of an empty road, in the middle of an unrelenting storm, she wasn't sure if this was something she could explain. All she knew, deep in her gut, was that something about this night was different, and that whatever this Mustang wanted, it wasn't going to leave until they listened. Sarah's breath was shallow, her fingers still gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The Mustang stood in front of the ambulance, its dark coat slick with rain, muscles tense beneath the downpour. It hadn't moved. It hadn't bolted. It hadn't reacted the way any normal horse should have. Instead, it stood there staring, waiting, demanding. Lucas let out a slow breath beside her. This is insane, he muttered, running a hand through his damp hair. I mean, what the hell do we do here? Just sit. Sarah swallowed hard, her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew, deep in her gut, that this wasn't random. This horse wasn't lost. It wasn't confused. It had stopped them for a reason. And now it wanted something. She could feel it, a strange, unexplainable pull in her chest, like an invisible thread tying them to the animal. She wet her lips and finally spoke. We follow it? Lucas turned to her, eyes wide with disbelief. Follow it? Into the storm? Into nowhere? Are you hearing yourself? Sarah exhaled sharply, trying to suppress the frustration bubbling up inside her. Look at it, Lucas. It's not just standing here by accident. It wants us to do something. You see it. You feel it, don't you? Lucas didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the Mustang, studying it through the sheets of rain. The animal's ears flicked back and forth, its nostrils flaring, its body shivering, but not from fear. From urgency. Lucas sighed, rubbing his face with both hands. This is the dumbest thing we've ever done. Sarah's foot was already pressing against the gas. The ambulance inched forward, its headlights sweeping over the wet asphalt, illuminating the Mustang's soaked body as it turned, its hooves splashing through the shallow pools of water. And then, without hesitation, it began to move. Sarah kept the vehicle slow, barely rolling along as the Mustang trotted ahead, its dark form weaving through the rain like a phantom. The road became more treacherous, the rain making it difficult to see, but Sarah didn't stop. Lightning flashed, illuminating the Mustang for a brief second, just long enough for Sarah to see its head turn slightly, checking to make sure they were following. Lucas let out a small, humorless laugh. You gotta be kidding me. The Mustang picked up speed. Sarah pushed the gas pedal a little harder, ignoring the creeping fear in the back of her mind. The trees on either side of the road grew denser, thick shadows cast between them. The further they drove, the rougher the terrain became. And then the Mustang veered left, off the road. Sarah slammed the brakes. The ambulance skidded slightly before jerking to a stop. Lucas turned to her with wide eyes. Okay, now what? Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs. The Mustang had disappeared into the tree line, the darkness swallowing it whole. The sound of the storm was deafening, the rain hammering against the roof, the wind howling through the branches like a warning. She should turn back. She should ignore this. This was stupid. And yet, she unbuckled her seatbelt. Lucas groaned. Oh, hell no. Stay or come, she interrupted, shoving open the driver's side door. A blast of wind and water hit her instantly, soaking her clothes in seconds. The cold was sharp and biting, but she pushed forward, her boots sinking into the mud as she stumbled toward the trees. Sarah! Lucas cursed behind her, but she heard the sound of his door slamming shut, his hurried footsteps chasing after her. She didn't stop. The forest swallowed them whole. The canopy above barely provided shelter. The wind twisted through the branches, and the rain still found its way through, soaking the ground beneath them. Sarah's breath came in short gasps, her boots struggling against the mud as she pushed forward. And then she saw it. The Mustang stood just ahead, barely visible in the dim light. Its dark eyes gleamed with something that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was waiting. Then, with a flick of its head, it stepped aside. And that's when she saw it. Lying in the mud, barely breathing, was a foal. Sarah's breath hitched. It was small, far too small. Its ribs were visible beneath its thin, wet coat. Its legs were folded awkwardly beneath it, its head barely lifted from the ground. Its eyes, dark and glassy, blinked slowly, as if it didn't even have the strength to fully register its surroundings. "Oh my God," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. Sarah fell to her knees beside it, not caring about the mud that immediately soaked through her pants. The foal's body trembled violently, its chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid gasps. Sarah reached out with a trembling hand, fingers brushing against the damp, matted fur. The foal didn't react. It was barely clinging to life. Lucas crouched beside her, shaking his head. "Jesus, what do we do?" Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. "We have to help it." Lucas let out a breath. "How?" "We're not vets, Sarah. And this thing," he motioned to the tiny, fragile body before them. "This thing is half dead." Sarah clenched her jaw. "We have blankets in the ambulance. We can keep it warm. We can call someone, get help." Lucas hesitated, glancing at the Mustang. The horse was still standing there, unmoving, watching them. Then, almost as if it understood, it took a step closer. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't just a lost foal. This wasn't just some random animal in the woods. This Mustang, this mother, had brought them here. It had led them through the storm, through the trees, because it knew. It knew its baby was dying. Sarah's chest ached. She turned to Lucas, her eyes burning. "We have to try." Lucas exhaled through his nose, nodding once. "Okay, but we have to move fast." Sarah wasted no time. She stripped off her rain-soaked jacket and carefully draped it over the foal's tiny frame, trying to shield it from the worst of the wind. The animal barely reacted. Its body was ice cold. Lucas was already on his feet, jogging back toward the ambulance. Sarah didn't take her eyes off the foal, her fingers gently stroking along its muzzle. "Hang on, little one," she murmured. "Just hang on." Thunder rumbled overhead. The Mustang let out a deep, mournful sound, a noise that sent shivers through Sarah's entire body. And then, for the first time that night, she realized something terrifying. They weren't just racing against the storm anymore. They were racing against death. The storm did not let up. If anything, the rain pounded harder against the ambulance's metal frame as Sarah drove forward, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, barely carving slivers of visibility through the relentless downpour. Her heart was still racing, her body cold and soaked, but she didn't have time to think about herself. All she could focus on was the fragile life lying in the back of the ambulance, the foal barely holding on, its breath shallow, its frail body curled under the blankets they had wrapped around it. Lucas sat beside it, his fingers checking for a pulse, his eyes darting between the foal and the equipment they had repurposed to monitor it. The ambulance wasn't meant for this. It was meant for human emergencies, not dying newborn animals, but they had no other choice. The foal was so weak, its ribs visible beneath its wet coat, its limbs too limp for comfort. Every uneven breath it took sent an icy wave of dread through Sarah's veins. She had seen people fight for life before, had watched patients claw their way back from the brink, but this was different. This little thing had no voice, no way to beg for help. It had no one but them, and its mother. Sarah glanced up at the rearview mirror, her breath catching in her throat. The Mustang was still there. Its dark body was barely visible in the haze of rain and red taillights, but it was there, galloping through the storm, hooves splashing through puddles, mane whipping wildly in the wind. It hadn't hesitated. The second the ambulance had pulled away from the muddy clearing, it had followed, keeping pace, never once turning back toward the forest it had come from. It had chosen to trust them, a wild animal, a creature meant to fear and flee from humans, was chasing them through the night. Not out of anger, not to reclaim what they had taken, but because it refused to abandon its child. Sarah swallowed hard, her chest tightening as she pressed the gas pedal a little harder. She had no idea how long the Mustang could keep running like this, but she knew one thing for certain: it wouldn't stop. Not until it knew whether its baby would live or die. Lucas let out a sharp breath, pulling Sarah's attention back to the road. "It's still breathing," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. "Barely, but it's there." Sarah nodded, keeping her focus locked ahead. The highway stretched endlessly before them, empty and slick with water, the dark world outside illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning. Every few minutes, she checked the mirror again, and every time, the Mustang was still there, still running, still fighting against the storm. "How far are we?" Lucas asked, his voice tight with urgency. 15 minutes, maybe less. Make it 10. Sarah didn't argue. She pushed the ambulance harder, the tires skidding slightly as they cut through the flooded road. The foal let out the faintest noise, a weak, barely there whimper that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. Lucas reacted instantly, adjusting the blankets, checking the tiny, fragile body for signs of worsening distress. His hands were steady, but his expression was tense, his jaw clenched. Sarah had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who knew they were losing the fight. "Come on, little one," Lucas murmured, his voice softer than Sarah had ever heard it. "Stay with us?" The Mustang let out a sound from behind them, a deep, mournful call that carried through the storm. It was still running, still chasing, but Sarah could feel the fear in that sound. It knew time was running out. The rain blurred everything outside, but the road ahead remained clear enough to navigate. Sarah forced herself to focus, to shut out everything but the task at hand. They were almost there. If they could just keep the foal alive a little longer, just a few more minutes, maybe, just maybe, it would have a chance. The ambulance tore down the road, the Mustang never faltering behind it. The ambulance screeched to a halt, its tires skidding slightly on the rain-slicked pavement before finally settling. Sarah barely registered the motion. She was already unbuckling her seatbelt, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. The foal had stopped making sounds. That silence was worse than any cry of pain, worse than any shuddering breath. It meant the tiny, fragile body was slipping further away. Lucas threw open the back doors, his face tight with urgency as he unfastened the gurney. The foal barely stirred beneath the thick blankets wrapped around its thin frame. Its small chest barely moved, its breath so faint Sarah had to strain to see them. The only thing giving her hope was that it was still warm. Barely. She gritted her teeth and forced herself to move. There was no time to hesitate. Lucas jumped down first, grabbing the gurney handles, while Sarah took the other end, carefully lowering the foal onto the ground. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it had worsened, drumming against the pavement, turning every surface into a slick, treacherous mess. But Sarah didn't care. She barely felt it anymore. Above the howling wind, the Mustang let out a piercing cry. Sarah turned just in time to see it emerge from the darkness, its massive form illuminated by the glow of the station's security lights. The horse was drenched, its dark coat slick with rain, its mane plastered to its neck. Its nostrils flared, its breath rising in great, heaving clouds of steam against the cold night air. It had run the entire way. Sarah's throat tightened. The Mustang was exhausted. She could see it in the way its sides heaved, the tremble in its powerful legs. And yet, despite its fatigue, it didn't stop. It kept its dark, intelligent eyes locked on the foal, watching their every movement, its body coiled with tension. It didn't trust them. Not yet. Lucas exhaled sharply beside her. "That thing is going to charge us if we don't move fast," he muttered. "I can feel it." Sarah swallowed hard and turned back to the foal. There was no time to worry about the Mustang. They had to get the baby inside. "Now, let's go." They pushed forward, wheeling the gurney across the lot, boots splashing through puddles, breath coming in frantic gasps. The wind tore at their soaked clothes, the storm refusing to let up, as if nature itself was determined to test them. The station stable was just ahead, a simple structure, usually used for rescues or housing injured animals before transferring them to specialists. It wasn't much, but it was warm, it was dry, and it was the foal's only chance. Lucas shoved the door open, and the two of them rushed inside, dragging the gurney in behind them. The sudden warmth hit Sarah like a shock. The stable smelled of hay and damp wood, of horses and old leather. The familiar scent grounded her, but only for a second. There was no time for relief. Lucas grabbed extra blankets from a nearby shelf, tossing them onto the foal. Sarah worked fast, checking its pulse again, feeling for warmth, trying to ignore the way its small body felt too light, too fragile. "Come on, baby," she murmured under her breath. "Don't quit on us." Lucas was already moving, grabbing the emergency medical kit they kept stored for cases like this. He worked with swift efficiency, his fingers deft despite the urgency in his movements. "Its body temperature is too low," he muttered. "We need heat. Fast." Sarah nodded, shoving one of the thicker blankets under the foal's trembling form, trying to insulate it from the cold ground. She grabbed a nearby heating lamp, adjusting the angle so that it cast a pool of warm light directly onto the tiny body. The foal barely reacted. Sarah's stomach twisted painfully. It was too weak, too cold. They had gotten here just in time, but just in time might not be enough. Lucas let out a sharp breath. "We need fluids." Sarah grabbed the 4-bag from the kit, her fingers shaking as she prepared the line. They had done this before, treated animals in emergencies, stabilized them before getting them to the right facilities. But this wasn't just any animal. This was a baby. And outside, waiting in the storm, was its mother. Sarah didn't know why that thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her, but it did. She turned, her heart hammering, and saw the Mustang standing just beyond the open stable doors. The rain poured down in thick sheets, but the Mustang didn't move. It stood there, just at the threshold, staring inside, watching them. Sarah's breath hitched. It wasn't coming in. Lucas followed her gaze, then let out a low curse. "Shit." Sarah stepped forward before she even realized what she was doing. The Mustang's ears flicked back slightly, its muscles tightening, but it didn't bolt. It just watched her. The cold wind whipped at Sarah's soaked clothes, but she barely felt it. She swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "She doesn't trust us enough to come in." Lucas frowned. "Can we force her in?" Sarah shook her head immediately. "No. If we push her, she might panic and bolt. We can't risk that." They stood there in silence for a moment, rain pounding against the stable roof, wind howling through the open doors. Then slowly Sarah crouched down. She kept her movements slow, deliberate, lowering herself to the Mustang's level, making herself look as unthreatening as possible. Lucas watched in silence. Sarah took a breath. "Come on, girl," she murmured, voice soft despite the storm. "Come see your baby." The Mustang didn't move. Sarah swallowed hard, her heart hammering. "You let us here?" You trusted us. We're not going to hurt it." The Mustang exhaled sharply, its breath clouding in the cold air. Its ears flicked forward. Sarah reached out her hand, palm up, fingers barely trembling. She had no idea if this would work. Seconds passed. Then, the Mustang took a step forward. Sarah held perfectly still. Another step, then another. And then, before Sarah could fully process what was happening, the Mustang crossed the threshold into the stable. Lucas let out a breath of disbelief. Holy shit! Sarah couldn't breathe. The Mustang stood there, inches away from her, close enough that she could see the rain dripping from its long lashes, the tension still coiled in its muscles. But it wasn't afraid anymore. It turned its head, looking past her, looking at the foal lying on the gurney. Sarah stepped back slowly, giving it space. The Mustang let out a soft, deep sound, almost a whisper, almost a plea. And for the first time that night, the foal stirred. Sarah's breath caught. The tiny creature let out a weak, trembling sound in response. Lucas exhaled. It knows its mom is here. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. The foal wasn't out of danger yet, but it was fighting. And now, it wasn't fighting alone. The night had stretched endlessly, a battle of exhaustion and desperation, of rain-soaked hands and whispered prayers. But dawn finally began to creep through the thick storm clouds. The foal, weak but alive, lay wrapped in blankets inside the stable, its tiny chest rising and falling with slow, shallow breaths. The heating lamp cast a warm glow over its frail body, a stark contrast to the icy winds that still howled outside. Sarah hadn't moved in hours. She sat beside the foal, watching it with tired, unblinking eyes, her heart clinging to every fragile breath it took. The night had drained her completely, leaving her soaked to the bone, shivering, aching in ways she hadn't even realized. But none of that mattered, because the foal was still alive. Lucas sat against the wall nearby, arms crossed, his head tilted back, eyes half closed in exhaustion. Every now and then, he glanced towards Sarah and the foal, his expression unreadable. Outside, the Mustang remained. He had refused to leave, standing just beyond the stable doors, a silent sentinel watching over his child. The wild horse was still drenched, his muscles tense, his ears flicking toward every small movement inside. But he hadn't run. He had chosen to stay. Sarah exhaled, rubbing her face with both hands, her fingers freezing against her damp skin. He hasn't moved all night. Lucas didn't open his eyes. Yeah, I noticed. She turned slightly, glancing at the Mustang through the stable's open doors. The wind had died down, the rain easing into a light drizzle, but the horse remained in the same spot, unmoving, unblinking. Sarah's chest tightened. We can't leave him out there forever. Lucas let out a slow breath and finally sat up straighter, rolling his stiff shoulders. Yeah, but what's the alternative? We can't keep a wild Mustang and a newborn foal in the station's stable forever. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. He was right. This wasn't a long-term solution. The foal needed more than just emergency care. It needed safety, a real home, somewhere it could grow and heal, away from the dangers of the wild. And the Mustang, its father, would never leave it. There was only one answer. Sarah grabbed her phone, her fingers still stiff from the cold as she scrolled through her contacts. She hesitated for a second, then pressed the call button. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Sarah? The voice was familiar, warm despite the early hour. She exhaled. Hey, Dr. Holt, I need a favor. 2 hours later, the sound of tires crunching against wet gravel filled the air. Sarah stood outside the stable, arms crossed, her exhaustion barely dulled by the quick nap she had managed to steal while waiting. Lucas stood beside her, sipping from a steaming cup of coffee, his breath visible in the chilly morning air. A long silver horse trailer rumbled to a stop a few feet away. The rain had finally stopped, but the ground was still soaked, puddles reflecting the pale morning sky. Dr. Holt, a middle-aged veterinarian with a weathered face and kind eyes, stepped out of the truck, adjusting his rain jacket as he surveyed the scene. Damn, he muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. You weren't kidding? Sarah forced a tired smile. Yeah, it's been a long night. Dr. Holt approached the stable, his eyes immediately locking onto the Mustang standing just beyond the doors. The wild horse snorted, ears flicking back, but it didn't move. Well, that's not something you see every day, Dr. Holt murmured. Sarah followed his gaze. He's been here all night. Dr. Holt nodded slowly, then turned his attention to the foal inside. And the baby? Still weak but stable, Lucas answered. Barely. Dr. Holt studied the foal for a long moment before nodding again. We'll take them both. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Dr. Holt turned back to the Mustang. But that's going to be the real challenge, isn't it? Sarah followed his gaze. The wild horse had begun pacing, his muscles tense, his nostrils flaring. He didn't like the trailer. He didn't understand what was happening, and Sarah could feel his unease like a pulse in the air. Lucas sighed. How the hell do we get him inside? Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped forward, her boots sinking slightly in the damp ground. The Mustang's ears twitched, his dark eyes snapping to her, but he didn't bolt. Slowly, she crouched down, lowering herself to his level, just like she had the night before. The Mustang snorted again, stamping a hoof against the wet ground, but he didn't move away. Sarah swallowed. You trust me, don't you? The horse didn't answer, of course, but it didn't run. She took a slow breath. We're not taking him away from you. I promise. The Mustang's ears flicked back again, uncertainty rippling through his powerful frame. Sarah hesitated, then made a split-second decision. Without looking away, she called over her shoulder, Lucas, bring the foal. Lucas hesitated. You sure? Yeah. He didn't question her further. A moment later, she heard the rustling of blankets, the creak of the gurney as Lucas wheeled it forward. The foal let out the faintest sound, a weak, trembling whimper. The Mustang reacted instantly. His entire body tensed, his head snapping toward the noise. His muscles bunched, his nostrils flaring as he took a step forward. Sarah didn't move. She just waited. Another step, then another. The foal let out another weak cry. The Mustang let out a deep, shuddering breath, then finally, hesitantly, took the final step forward. Sarah held still, her own breath catching in her throat as the massive wild horse, so powerful, so untamed, stepped inside the trailer. For a moment, everything was still. Then Dr. Holt moved fast, securing the door behind him, locking it into place. Sarah exhaled shakily. Lucas let out a breath beside her, rubbing a hand over his face. Jesus, that actually worked. Dr. Holt chuckled. I'll be damned. Sarah turned back to the trailer. The Mustang wasn't panicking. He wasn't fighting. He was just standing there, his head lowered, his eyes locked onto the tiny, fragile foal resting beneath the blankets. Sarah swallowed against the tightness in her throat. He trusts us? Dr. Holt smiled, shaking his head. Then let's not make him regret it. Sarah nodded. She placed one hand against the cool metal of the trailer, whispering so softly only the Mustang could hear. You're safe now. The trailer rumbled to life, rolling forward down the road, carrying both father and child toward their new home. The days blurred into weeks, but the memory of that stormy night never left Sarah. Even as life returned to its usual rhythm at the station, emergency calls, long shifts, and late-night coffee refills, she found herself thinking about them. The Mustang, the foal, the way the wild horse had followed them through the storm, unwavering in its determination. The way it had hesitated before stepping into the trailer, trusting her against every instinct it had. She had never seen anything like it, and she doubted she ever would again. The first update from the sanctuary came 3 days after they had left. Sarah had been at her desk, half-heartedly working through paperwork when her phone buzzed. Foal is doing better, slowly regaining strength. Mustang won't leave its side. We'll keep you posted. She had exhaled, something inside her loosening that she hadn't even realized was still wound tight. They had made it. The baby had survived the night. The next update came a week later. The foal is standing on its own, still wobbly, but improving, eating well. Mustang growing restless but still refuses to be separated. Sarah had smiled at that one. Of course he wouldn't leave. After everything, There was no force in the world strong enough to pull him away now. Lucas had glanced over from where he was nursing his coffee, raising an eyebrow. "They still good?" Sarah nodded, passing him her phone. He skimmed the message before huffing out a soft laugh. "That horse is as stubborn as you are." Sarah smirked, shaking her head. "Takes one to know one." But beneath her amusement, something deeper lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just any rescue. This wasn't just another story in a long list of emergencies they had responded to. This was something different, something that mattered. She wasn't sure when the idea took root, but once it did, it refused to leave. At first, it was just a journal entry, a way to put the thoughts somewhere outside of herself. She sat at her kitchen table one night after a long shift, staring at the blank document on her laptop, fingers hovering over the keys. Then she started typing. She wrote about the storm, the rain that had swallowed the road, the wild Mustang that had appeared like a ghost through the downpour. She wrote about the way it had refused to run, the way it had stomped its hooves against the pavement like a desperate call for help. She wrote about the foal, so small, so fragile, barely clinging to life in the mud. She wrote about trust, about fear, about love, the kind of love that didn't need words, the kind that ran through storms and chased after ambulances, the kind that didn't let go, even when everything else in the world told it to. When she finished, she stared at the screen, uncertain. Then she hit publish. She hadn't expected much. Maybe a few people would read it. Maybe some local animal lovers would share it. Maybe, at best, it would be a sweet story that made its way around a few small circles before fading away. She had no idea what was coming. The first notifications arrived within hours. A few hundred reads, some comments, people calling it incredible, calling it moving. By the next morning, the numbers had skyrocketed. Tens of thousands of shares, news outlets picking it up, celebrities retweeting it, attaching messages about resilience, about love, about the unbreakable bond between a parent and child, human or otherwise. Sarah watched in stunned disbelief as her phone continued to buzz, the notifications rolling in nonstop. Lucas was the first to react, glancing up from his phone with a low whistle. "Jesus, Sarah, you seeing this?" Sarah barely managed a nod. What is happening?" Lucas smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You went viral, that's what." She barely had time to process before the call started. News stations wanted interviews. Animal rights organizations wanted to use the story for awareness campaigns. Even the sanctuary had reached out, telling her that visitors were flocking to see the Mustang and his foal, donations pouring in to support their care. And the comments. Thousands of them. "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever read. I can't stop crying. That horse knew. That horse trusted. Love is love, no matter the species. If only humans were half as loyal as this Mustang. Someone turn this into a documentary. I need to see this." Sarah was overwhelmed. She hadn't expected any of this. Hadn't imagined that a single night, one storm, one rescue, could turn into something this massive. Lucas grinned at her from across the room, nudging her foot with his. "Guess you're famous now." She rolled her eyes, shaking her head. "This isn't about me." Lucas lifted an eyebrow. "No, but you told the story. And apparently, the world needed to hear it." The updates from the sanctuary kept coming. "Foal is strong enough to run now. Mustang still never leaves its side. They're inseparable. We introduced them to the larger herd today." Mustang was protective at first, but after a while, he let them approach. "Foal is learning how to be wild. It's beautiful." Sarah held on to those words. She let them settle deep inside her. Let them remind her why she had chosen this life in the first place. To help, to heal, to bear witness to the moments that mattered. One final update arrived weeks later. "They're free." Sarah's breath caught as she opened the attached video. It was sunrise. The golden light spilled over the rolling fields of the sanctuary, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The Mustang stood at the crest of a small hill, the foal beside him, now strong, now steady. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the wind rippling through their manes, their bodies still and watchful. Then, as if sensing something unspoken, the Mustang turned and ran. The foal hesitated only for a second before following, its small legs carrying it forward with surprising grace. They disappeared into the open land, their silhouettes vanishing against the rising sun. Sarah exhaled slowly, watching the screen, her heart full in a way she hadn't expected. Lucas nudged her shoulder. "Worth it?" She nodded, swallowing against the lump in her throat. "Yeah." She closed the video, locking the image of them running free deep inside her memory. This was their ending. No, their beginning.